going to jump into the Word of God today. We've already sang and we've worshiped and we got some other things that we've done, but it's important that we hear the Word of God today. And as we celebrate 5 years of serving and learning and growing together, we are no doubt at an interesting point. We are no doubt at an interesting point. I would even call it a turning point. Now, not a turning point in our theology, not a turning point in our identity, not a turning point in our character, not a turning point in our values, but no doubt we have to evaluate our methodology and our practices to figure out how do we continue to walk out this vision 5 years now. What would we do for the next 5 years? And can I be honest with you as a pastor? I don't know all the answers. I don't have everything down to a T. But what I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt is that we will continue to listen to the voice of God. We will continue to pioneer as we preached about last year. And we will continue to walk boldly into what God has for us. And as we step into a new series today, we're going to be doing this new series throughout the summer called Long Story Short. I want you to say that with me. Everybody say long story short. Come on, let's get some rhythm. And we've been out of rhythm. Let's say it again. Long story short. Now, this is a term that is often used when somebody's trying to describe a story or a conversation that could go a little bit longer than anticipated. But what they're trying to do is just get to the point a little bit quicker. You know, my wife does this to me all the time at home. Some of y'all wives or husbands do this to you. When I tell a story, I got to embellish. You know what I'm saying? I got to add some color to the story. I got to tell some other stories that connect to the story. And my wife calls this exaggeration. I don't call it exaggeration. I just say embellishment. And when you're telling a story, every now and then my wife will give me this look and she'll just say, hurry it up and get to the point. And when she does something like that, here's what I say, Danielle. I just say, long story short. And what I'm really saying is, let me just get to the point. I'm going to shorten this message because I can say something with power and impact in a short amount of time. And throughout the Bible, here's what's interesting. We love the long stories. You know, we love the characters of the biblical narrative who got a whole book written after them. We love to read all of these passages about David and Daniel, and we'll read about other characters like Moses. He pretty much is the book of Exodus, and that's awesome. But there's some short stories that have a lasting impact. There's some short narratives and some short parts of Scripture that we sometimes can skip over or overlook or undervalue and not truly appreciate and not really take seriously the impact these short stories can have on our life. And so over the summer, we're going to be dealing with this new series, Long Story Short. And as we begin to think about this conversation today, I want to take you to the book of 1 Chronicles chapter 4. 1 Chronicles chapter 4. And I'm going to read verses 1 through 12. 1 Chronicles chapter 4, verses 1 through 12. I'm reading from the New Living Translation. And the heading here says this: Other descendants of Judah. Other descendants of Judah. Now, I'm about to say a whole bunch of names. If I mess 3 of them up, all my theologians, don't judge me. But here's what it says, 1 Chronicles 4, starting at verse 1. Other descendants of Judah. The descendants of Judah were Perez, Hezron, Carmi, Hur, and Shabal. Shabal's son, Rahab, was the father of Jahath. Jahath was the father of Ahumai and Lahad. And this kind of goes on. I'm going to keep it going. These were the families of the Zorathites. Then it says in verse 3, the descendants of Etam were Jezreel, Ishma, Itbash, their sister. I'm not even going to try to get that one right. And then in 4, it says Penuel, the father of Jedor, and Ezar, the father of Hushah. These were the descendants of Hur, the firstborn, the ancestors of Bethlehem. And it keeps going, and it keeps going, and it keeps going. Skip to verse 9. Look at what it says. And then it says, and then there was a man named Jabez, who was more honorable than any of his brothers. His mother named him Jabez because his birth was so painful. He was the one who prayed to the God of Israel, oh, that you would bless me and expand my territory. Please be with me in all that I do and keep me from all trouble and pain. I love what happens. God responds and says, and God granted him his request. Verse 11, Caleb, the brother of Shuhah, was the father of Mahir. Mahir was the father of Eshton. Eshton was the father of Beth Rapha. Wait a minute. Seems interesting here. It just goes back to business as usual. Verse 1 through 8, just listing out the lineage. And then it stops for a moment to talk about this guy named Jabez for 2 verses. And then it just goes back to business as usual. If you want to fact check me, just read the whole chapter. I mean, it just says, let me just get through all these other descendants, but never again does it stop to articulate who they are and what they've done or any details about their life. Matter of fact, we don't even really see Jabez appear ever more in the scripture except for one other time, which we'll look at in a moment. And it's interesting to me that Jabez would interrupt the flow of the chapter. That the chronicler of this particular writer, he would interrupt the flow of the entire chapter to tell us two things or two verses about the character and the honor of Jabez. And it's in this in mind that I think all of us have to ask ourselves, are we living a life that jumps off the pages as well? We have to ask ourselves, are we living a life that when people see how we live and see how we talk and see our faith and see our conversations and see how we navigate uncharted waters in uncertain times, do they see a life that jumps off the pages? And so for the purpose of our sermon today, I want to give you this title for part one of this series. Here it is. It's a long title, but I want you to catch it. We interrupt your regularly scheduled programming. We interrupt your regularly scheduled programming. If you've ever seen this come across your television before, I remember living with my grandparents at a certain period in my life, and this would often happen on their television, and you hear a little sound come across the television. Y'all remember the time it'd be like, beep, and this beep would come across the screen. I'm going to say it one time because my voice kind of cracked a little bit. I'm going to try one more time. Beep, and the beep would come across the screen, and as the beep came across the screen, you were mad because it always seemed to happen at an inopportune moment. Can I get a witness right there? Like you were just watching something, and the conversation was getting good, and it was getting to that point where you was like, who done it? That's the look I feel like you have at the TV. You're like, who done it? And then all of a sudden, you get into that point, and you say, beep. And this interruption comes across the screen. And Lauren, I gotta admit to you, I used to get irritated when this interruption would come across the screen because most of the time, it wasn't necessary. Like you ever got one, if you was at the good part, and this is before you can rewind. You know what I'm saying? I don't even got no TV still that can rewind. So if I miss it, I just missed it. I got to wait for it to come out later. But you ever was watching something, and then the alert came across the screen, and it says, we now interrupt your regularly scheduled programming. They tell me what? They tell me that a storm is on the way. Well, I'm inside. I'm good. Let me finish my show. Truth of the matter is that there are all the time that we see these interruptions. But every now and then, somebody say every now and then. Every now and then, there's an interruption that happens that's worth your attention. Every now and then, there's an interruption that happens that's worth you pausing for a moment. Every now and then, there's a moment that happens that you need to know about with urgency. In other words, every now and then, their proclamation is more important than the programming. I want to talk to 20 people today who might be watching this or in the room who might be saying, Vernon, I'm looking at my life right now and I'm seeing the interruption of the world. I'm seeing the interruption of justice. I'm seeing the interruption of our communities. I'm seeing the interruption of ethnic equality and equity and ethnic relations. I'm seeing the interruption of the pandemic. I'm seeing the interruption of the school system. And God, what are we called to do? Can I tell you something? We're called to live a life like Jabez that jumps off the page, that makes up in its mind, we are the interruption that the world is looking for. I came to let somebody know today, the world is not ready for the interruption that you are. That you are called to be an interruption to the noise. That you are called to be an interruption to the mundane. That you are called to be an interruption to the normal. And for the last 3.5, 4 months, I've been wrestling Pastor Rivers with this idea that we've been complaining about the interruption. But what if God is calling us to be the interruption? What if God is calling us to say we are the ones that should be interrupting the regularly scheduled programming? That our voices should be cutting through the noise, that our behavior should be cutting through the silence, that our voice should be one that raises up, that our life should be one that signifies and symbolizes what it means to interrupt the regularly scheduled programming. As we begin to think about this, I begin to think about this idea of Jabez. And in 5 years, I think Jabez has something to say to all of us, personally and corporately, about how, Chelsea, we become the people of God that interrupt the regularly scheduled programming. It says that he was a man who was more honorable than any of his brothers. Now, it's important for us to appropriately understand and contextualize this, Dev, because when we say more honorable in the English translation, that's really not the Hebrew contextualization. The Hebrew contextualization would have been that he was more honored. That he was not more honorable just in behavior, but he was somebody who was honored. Now, this is problematic. It's problematic because in the day and time that this particular chronicler is writing this passage, he writes it and he specifically lists out names and lineage. Now, in this day and time, names had meaning. You know, we just pick names now because they sound good. You know, Mercedes, you know what I'm saying? Just, you know, Keisha with a asterisk and a hashtag, you know. but the reality of it was they picked names with meaning. Every name was representative of one's character. And so Jabez literally meant one Daniel who was bore in pain. His mother named him to reflect the problem of his past. His mother named him to represent the problem that he was for her. He got a name that was intended to remind him consistently of what he was not and not what he was. And every time somebody would have called his name in his community, every time somebody would have met him for the first time, every time he would have approached a girl and be like, yo, what's good? What's your name? She would be like, my name is Rehoboth. And she would have been like, what's your name? He would have been like, my name is Jabez. She would be like, you got pain attached to you. Got time for that. His name would have been a barrier to his blessings. His name would have been a barrier to his promise. And yet, let me go a little bit further and just give you some history here, because the point is not that Jabez's prayer had magic power. Many people of his time would have prayed a prayer like Jabez. The point of his prayer that we all should grapple with is that Jabez's prayer is God showing that he can always do something for your destination beyond your location. I'm gonna say it again. That God can always give you a destination that does not reflect your present location. I know you're saying, Vernon, prove it. I'm glad you asked. Two things that I think we need to see about Jabez's life to take the prayer a little bit further, to be able to ask ourselves how we live a life like Jabez that is an interruption to the regularly scheduled program. Number one, I think we got to see this. We see a couple prompts to this passage in Matthew 7:7. It says, ask, promise Jesus, and it will be given to you. James 4:2 says this, you do not have because you do not what? Ask. Okay, so we see that asking is a critical part of the narrative of a life of faith. Now, I want to make sure we have an appropriate theology. That does not mean that everything we ask for, God will do because we ask. But what it does mean is when we talk to God, we should ask in alignment with his ability. So here's what I want you to understand today. I got 3 big ideas that I want you to wrestle with when you go home. I'm going to get right out of your way. But the first thing that I want you to wrestle with is this idea that you have to make an ask beyond your means. Okay, y'all quiet. I thought somebody would shout on that low. You got to make an ask beyond your means. Bruce Wilkinson, who wrote the book, The Prayer of Jabez, says this. You should be attempting something large enough, watch this, that failure is guaranteed. Watch this. He says it, unless God steps in. Okay, let me say it again. Bruce says, I'm just talking about Bruce. Bruce says that the prayer of Jabez should prompt in us the ability to say, I should be asking for something that guarantees my failure. Unless, somebody say unless God steps in. Because whenever we pray a prayer, we should ask for something that we can't do on our own. I need somebody to understand this today, that there's some prayers that you've been praying that are too small for what God has on your life. That there's some prayers that our church is about to expand. We're about to pray for increase. We're about to pray for more than what we have now. Not because we're greedy, not because we're selfish, but if we serve God, why would we ask for less than what he's capable of? I got some prayers that I'm praying, Pastor Reggie, and I don't know where the money comes from. I got some prayers that we're praying, and I don't know where the resources are coming from. We got some prayers that we're going to pray, Mariah, and we don't know who's going to open up the door. All we know is that if God be for us, it's more than the world against us. And so the first thing I want to do is encourage you not to just simply ask for the mundane, but ask for things beyond your means. And I want to be very clear before I move on to the second point. That does not mean you can't ask God for the simple things. Does not mean that you can't pray for peace and favor, and doesn't mean you can't pray for joy in your home. I'm not saying that at all. But whenever you got a Jabez moment in your spirit, ask for that which goes beyond your own ability. As a church, we're going to start asking for some things. We're going to start praying for some things. We're going to start believing God that 5 years was good, but we don't believe this is the end. This is just the beginning. And as we begin to believe God for what's next, we're going to ask God for more than we could ever ask or imagine. We're going to ask beyond our means. We're going to honor what we have in our hand. We're going to be good stewards of what we already have. We're going to be grateful for what God has already done. But we're going to constantly tell God we're ready to get out of the boat and walk on water all the more. Ask beyond your means. Here's the second thing, though. Second thing that I think we got to see, and I'm not going to give you the big point yet because I think you got to see something here. What's interesting is I told you about Jabez's name. It's important for us to understand this idea today, Mariah, that Jabez's name would have been a barrier. Jabez's name would have been a problem for his promise. If he was living in his culture, he would have been walking around, and every time he would have said his name, Chris, he would have found out that it was a problem for him to be able to progress in life. I think his mama was wrong for this. Frank, I don't know how she loved him and named him Jabez. She knew goodness well that by naming him Jabez, he was going to encounter some challenges. Now, look, I know y'all real saved today, but there's a few of y'all that know some mamas like this and know some daddies like this. They didn't name their kids some things. We say, why? Why you do that? Why you do that to that baby? That baby put that name on that application. They're going to be like, stop playing. The reality of it is, there's some names that you've encountered in your life. Come on, tell the truth, shame the devil. That you be like, huh? What you say now? Say it one more time. Say it one more time. LaDasha with a dash. I thought you was playing when you put the dash in there. I literally know a guy, my cousin was a teacher. LaDasha. If LaDasha's watching, I so apologize. He thought it was LaDasha. She thought he was playing. She said, no, I'm going to put the dash in the middle of my name. I said, boy, she got to do better. Truth of the matter is, there's some names that can present a challenge. There's some names that can get in the way of some things. And Jabez understands what it's like to live with a name, Nick, that can create problems for your promise. But here's what I love about Jabez's prayer. Jabez prays a prayer and teaches us an extremely valuable lesson that you can never be negligent in using a name. Say it again. This is the second big idea. I want you to write it down. You can never be negligent in using a name. Watch this. Because the name that you use determines the power of your progress. Because the name that you use determines the power of your progress. Jabez, by all accounts, should not have been honored by anybody because of the name that he carried. But somehow, not only was he honored, but God shows that he could do something beyond his name because he knew whose name to call on. Okay, Janelle, here it is. I went somewhere one time. I got an invitation by Travis Green. Love my boy Travis. And Travis invited me to a conference one time in Florida, but I could not get into the conference. The conference was sold out. Trav, I love you, bro. Appreciate you. Jackie, we love you. And so Trav invited me to this conference, and they said you could come. And I'll never forget it, Trav. He invited me, and he said this. He said, when you get there, just go on in. Your name is on the list. And so I get there, y'all. I done flew all the way to Florida. I walk up to the registration table. I'm ready to go. I done checked into my room, and I said, hey, my name should be there. It's Vernon Gordon. And they said, sir, the conference is sold out. I said, I know that, but somebody put me on the list. And they said, sir, there ain't no name on no list. I said, no, but no, seriously, my name, I just flew to Florida. My name is somewhere on a list. You need to find the list because my name is on a list. And they began to tell me as we went through dialogue, she went to the back room and she scurried. She came back out. She said, sir, I apologize. We're completely sold out. I don't know who told you that. Now, all this time, it never dawned on me to just say the name of who invited me because I was trying not to be that person. Come on, everybody knows that person who everywhere they show up, they got a name drop. I was trying not to be that person, y'all. I promise you, I was trying not to be that person. Conversation went on for about 7 minutes, 7 good minutes. And she kept saying, there ain't no list, there ain't no name. And then all of a sudden, I just said, well, look, all right, look. Travis Green invited me. She said, oh, Travis. She said, let me go check. All of a sudden, Travis broke into the registration room. He was screaming. He gave me a big old hug. And from that point, I ain't even get no wristband. He walked me to the backstage. He walked me through the door. He walked me and introduced me to people I never would have met otherwise. Here's what I'm trying to help you to understand today. I stood in a place where I lacked progress, all because I didn't say a name that could give me access. Can I talk to 30 people today who've been trying to figure out what is God going to do in the next season of your life? God said, I'm just waiting on you to use the right name. You've been dependent on your name. You've been dependent on your mama name. You've been dependent on your daddy name. You've been dependent on your cousin name. You've been dependent on your last name. But if you could ever understand, my name can give you access beyond your ability. This is what I think God is trying to help us to understand through the life of Jabez. That each and every one of us is called to be an interruption, called to walk into spaces that we could not get into on our own, called to be representatives of the gospel, called to be ambassadors of his assignment in places that we never should be. But because we are walking with his name, there is assignment on each and every one of our life. Can I tell you something? There's an assignment on our church. There's an assignment on our church to walk in his name. There's an assignment on our church. When we started this church 5 years ago, I remember talking to many pastors in the city, and he said, y'all are crazy to launch with that little bit of money. I remember going to several conferences, and one in particular where they said, if you don't have a minimum of $60,000, ideally, you'll have $100,000. You shouldn't even consider trying to get something off the ground. And yet, we stayed the course. And even though we only had about $6,000 or $7,000, we had a name. And even though we didn't have all the resources we needed, we had a name. And even though we didn't have all the doors that we thought needed to be open, we had a name. And I came to let somebody know today, just like God has done something in the life of this church for the last 5 years, the name that brought us to this point is going to take us to the next place that God has for us. And I came to let you know the same God that brought our church to this point can bring you to what he has for you. But can't be negligent in whose name you use. Here's the last thing, though. I need you to understand today that not only must we make an ask beyond our means, not only must we never be negligent in using a name. But here's the last thing. I started to ask myself, what happened to Jabez? Like I started asking myself, Janine, where does Jabez go? It seems like he just disappears. I mean, I don't know about y'all, but I read through the Bible, and I don't see Jabez show up no more. I mean, for him to be honorable, for him to ask a big prayer, for him to show up and get blessed and God grant his request, Tia, Jabez just disappeared. And then I got to reading 2 Chronicles chapter 7. I lied, 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 54 through 55. And it says this. I never saw this before, Lauren. Watch this. It says, and the descendants of Salma were the people of Bethlehem, and the Netophilites of Joab, and the other half of the Mahanites, the Zorites. Look at this part, verse 55. And the families of scribes living at Jabez. And the families of scribes living at Jabez. And this is important to understand about this day and time, that many times families and villages would be comprised of those sharing in the same profession. Warriors would live around warriors, and those who were craftsmen would live around craftsmen, and those who were scribes and Levites and priests, they would all live amongst each other. And so it said that there's a village of scribes living at a place they identify as Jabez. Jabez is no longer a name, it's a location. It's no longer just a name, it's a legacy. It's land that God granted. He was a scribe, and many theologians have concluded that because the village of scribes lived at Jabez, that it is assumed that Jabez probably worked out his years as a scribe. Now, why is that significant? Because a scribe seems like an obscure task. He was just recording stuff. He was just hanging out in the background. He wasn't in the spotlight. He wasn't on the platform. Frank, he prayed a prayer. God bless me, expand my territory. And God does it. People from generation after generation, living at a land and legacy of Jabez. And yet, he lives out his life with a task that many people would not run after. Not a king, not a warrior. He expanded his territory through faithfulness to being a scribe. Here's the third thing I want you to wrestle with today as we think about how to be the interruption that God has called us to be. Each and every one of us is called to be an interruption to the regularly scheduled programming of our community, the regularly scheduled programming of our family, the regularly scheduled programming of our society, the regularly scheduled programming of our job life. We are called to interrupt. We're called to step in. We're called to make something different. And here's what I want you to wrestle with today, that faithfulness in the dark will produce fruit in the light. And faithfulness in the dark will produce fruit in the light. We've been living in this new house now for a year. We just celebrated a year this past week. And I've told you this story before, that once we got into it, Chelsea had to figure out how to take care of the shrubbery and the greenery and the plants and all of the stuff that was around the house. One of the things I had to figure out how to do was work my sprinkler system. Reggie had no idea. And as I began to try to figure it out on my own, I said, why is my grass still dying? Why is it not growing the way it should? Why are there patches and what's going on? Until finally I got a recommendation from Tim Perry. Tim said, I got a guy I'm going to send by. You're going to look at your stuff. Guy comes by and walks around. He looks at all the sprinkler heads. He said, everything's working. And he looks over here and he fixes this and he does a little thing over here. And he said, oh, I know part of your problem. He said, you're watering the grass too late in the day. He said, when you got here, there was already a schedule. But that schedule is not consistent with growth. They said, because if you water the grass too late and it's too hot, it does not have time to do its work beneath the surface. So they said, what we're going to do is we're going to move your time up so that the water goes out when it's still dark, before the sun can soak it up, before it can move you out of a place of health and growth. And we're going to move it to a time where it's going to water your grass in the dark, so that by the time the light comes out, that which needed to happen for growth has already taken root before it can be stolen. I came to let somebody know today that don't think this pandemic is not an opportunity to still pursue the promise God has on your life. That God may just be watering some things in the dark. Be faithful. That God might be watering some things where nobody sees. Be faithful. That God might be opening up doors that you can't even see yet. Be faithful. Because your faithfulness in the dark is going to produce fruit in the light. So don't be afraid of the regularly scheduled programming. You are called to be an interruption. You're called to step into tough conversations. You're called to be a leader in a time where everybody's running away. You're called to walk in faith and not fear. You're called to interrupt the regularly scheduled programming. As a church, it's my conviction about our future, even without all the details. I don't know what the governor's going to do. I don't know what the mayor's going to do. I don't know what the national government is going to do. I don't know what Dr. Fauci going to say. I don't know what none of them going to say, but I can tell you what I know. Tell you I know whose name we carry. I tell you what I know. I know that we can ask beyond what we could even think or imagine. And I tell you this, we're going to keep being faithful, because I believe that whatever we do now, God is going to use to produce fruit for our future. So I want to encourage you today. Let's all be like Jabez. Let's interrupt the regular. Let's interrupt the norm. Let's interrupt the comfortable. And let's make a decision to be those who take our bodies, our kids, our families, our cities, our communities, and our church into the future boldly, knowing that the best is still yet to come. So would you do me a favor?